almost everything that I tell you, I can document. I have a book on archaeological information. Once in a while, I'm going to be guessing, but I'll tell you when we get to that. And you know, as far as history is concerned, there's a lot of guessing. Do you know or know of Harry Fritz, the history instructor at the University of Montana? Well, Harry's been at that business for 30-some years, and he knows what he's up to. And I talked with him about a few things, and you know, commonly you hear people say, well, everybody knows. Well, a lot of times what everybody knows isn't really the way it is. And Harry said, I'll give you a hint that'll probably keep you out of trouble. And he said, if you're going to talk about history, you better be talking about records. And when you stop and think about that, that's pretty good advice. Records occur in a lot of different ways. Petrified bones, millions of years old, artwork that's uncovered in old cities, people who were there and saw it and wrote it down, and that's the kind of stuff you kind of want to stick with if you're talking about history. Now I'm going to be talking about some things that happened 60 million years ago. See, the nice part about that is nobody was there, so who can argue with me? But it's based on that type of history. The first horse that we know about in this part of the world is some archaeological remains that occur in Nebraska. And this little horse was about this tall. He was here about 60 million years ago. And Nebraska, in that area, was a swamp. And he lived on succulent vegetation. And there were lots of other animals there. Some of them liked to eat horses. And this is where the old American expression, there is safety in numbers, comes from. Because you see, if you're in those little horses back then acted just like horses do today. They lived kind of in groups together. They eat and live together. If something chases them, they all gather up in a bunch and run. The important thing to remember is, if there's a predator chasing a band of horses, they don't have to outrun the predator. They have to outrun most of their friends. And you'll notice that you get instructions when you're hiking back in the wilderness to go in groups. Same thing applies. If a grizzly bear takes after you, you don't have to outrun the bear. You have to outrun most of your friends. I don't know that you'll ever get that officially from any of the land management agencies, but I've observed that kind of to be the way it goes. Well, those little animals were called eohippus, and that's a scientific name for them. There's some argument as to whether that's the proper name, because there are some strict rules on how you name things that occurred a long time ago. But there's not really much argument among the scientists that this is the beginning of the horse. Now, there are some archaeological finds in other parts of the world that are about the same size as this animal. So, you know, Nebraska has really changed since then. So if we go, you know, we'll fast forward to 35 million years ago, then we'll look at the Moselle Valley in Germany. And the Moselle Valley produces some of the very finest hard coal available. But there's a bonus with that. It also produces some of the very finest fossils. And here's a fossil horse, bigger than our earlier little friend. And a complete fossil. Everything is there. There's even this little animal's last meal is still where his stomach should be. And but that deep jawbone will tell you that, you know, we're heading towards the horse here. 15 million years ago, in Nebraska again, there were quite a population of horses, rhinoceroses, giraffes, camels, all sorts of animals that we don't think of as being part of this part of the world, there was a major volcanic eruption in Idaho. The wind carried dust, ash, across to the southeast, covered a lot of country, and killed whatever animals lived in quite a long area there. And what killed them was this ash was very fine. They breathed it in while they were grazing. It finally plugged up their lungs and they died. And they were then covered with more ash that was blown in. Today, what's left there are forms where those animals had been. But it gives you a very detailed look at what those animals are like. Nebraska has a state park called Ashfall State Park, and you can find they've found the remains of many different kinds of animals and lots of them. If we get closer in history, about 35,000 years ago, on the coast of France, there were people living, and they lived in caves. And there were some caves that went back into the solid rock a long ways. Two of them have paintings on the walls. One of them has been accessible to people for a long time. And some of the paintings have been vandalized, but there's another one that the mouth was covered by a landslide maybe 6,000 years ago. And you couldn't get in there. And in 1994, there was enough erosion so that the very top of that opening became visible again. So the government of France, I think, really did a good job there. They fenced it off. They let no one in there except scientists. And they built a replica of part of that cave that looks just the way it does inside. And you can go there and look at these paintings. But the paintings then are pictures of the animals that lived then. And here are horses, lions, bears, muskox, and the people walking in there for the first time. It goes back in about 640 feet. And the people walking in there the first time found a large chunk of stone that had fallen from the ceiling. And way back then, the last guy out of there put a bear skull there looking towards the entrance. And that skull looked towards the entrance for 6,000 years before anybody came back. But it's preserved just the way it's been for them, just the way those people did it. Now, there was a picture of one of those paintings that showed a horse, and this was an Appaloosa, what we'd call a leopard Appaloosa, spots all over it. And then around the outside, around that horse, the people had done what we often do with the kindergartners up to the blackboard, put their hand on it and put chalk or something around it to show their hand. And these people used brushes made out of grass and natural dye that they made from local plants. And so here you see a bunch of these. Now I kind of cheated. I used a aerosol can, you know. I didn't find any of those in any of these caves. So these people must have, you know, done it the primitive way. And I thought, well, how big were these horses? Well, today the common way of measuring how big a horse is how many hands high he is. A man's hand across here is about 4 inches. So I took the divider out of my old high school drafting set, and my high school drafting set still has antler handles on it. They didn't have plastic back then. But I took the divider and then I walked that down over this horse to see how big he was. Well, he turned out to be 14 hands high. And I guess the next question is, was that done in perspective, in proper perspective or not? But anyway, that animal would have been, you know, about that big. He wouldn't be what we would call a saddle horse today, but in Mongolia, in that country, there are lots of folks riding horses not much bigger than that. And I saw an article in National Geographic of that area, showed a race that they had, and this same thing turned up on television. Not very big horses, and those people really used them. They were tough horses. And here's a picture of a guy riding one of these animals with clothing made out of skins, and he has a rawhide thong around the lower jaw. That's what he had to control the horse, and that was a common way that the Indians did it. And if it hadn't been for the AK-47 across his shoulder, that picture could have been taken, you know, hundreds of years ago. So those animals kept, you know, moved, and here moved back to this part of the world. In northwestern, if we look at the northwestern United States, we find a large area where there were some different animals than we see today. There were horses, mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, long-legged hyenas, short-nosed bear, giant beavers. 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, and all of those animals died shortly after that. And you can find their bones some places rather easily. In the southern part of the Black Hills, there's in South Dakota, there's a dig where they have come up with many mammoths. And this, well, apparently this was a sinkhole. And these big animals went down there for water and couldn't get back out and died there. So every one of these skeletons is complete. Every bone is right there. And why that happened, nobody really seems to know. The scientists who study that have various ideas. So they say that man followed him there from Asia. These animals were not used to people. You know, they had no fear of those little things running around there anyway, and that these people killed and ate them. Can you picture yourself with a stick and a piece of obsidian tied to it, attacking a mammoth? I can't see me doing that. But then, you know, who knows? Maybe they knew something we didn't. Anyway, those folks all disappeared. Those animals all disappeared. During the Ice Age, when a lot of the ocean water, as fresh water is piled up in glaciers, the land bridge from Alaska to Russia, Siberia, is available to cross. And that apparently was available a number of times. Now, it's about 390 feet underwater. But it's still there. And if the Ice Age comes back, it'll probably be available again. I'm not going to wait. But you know, from then on, no horses. Well, when Columbus, in Europe, the people were fighting one another all the time. Wars continually. Horses were the horsepower. So they bred horses to do what they needed to do in their wars. Mainly Germany, England, Belgium, those countries had knights with suits of armor, metal. It took a derrick to lift one of those knights on the horse. They needed big horses. Then they hung armor on the horses. So that was the first tank, really. Now, those things didn't really move real fast, but if one of them ever hit you, you knew it. The Spanish took a different route. The Spanish bred light cavalry horses. The Spanish cavalryman had a light metal helmet, a light metal breastplate, a shield, and a lance, and a horse that would look a lot like our quarter horses today. Very nice, fast horses. And that was the cavalry animal. That was also the cow horse. The Spanish worked cattle on the Spanish plateau with those kind of horses. The Spanish developed the saddle, pack saddle, the bridle, halter, rope, and the use of ropes. When Columbus came over, the first time he landed in the West Indies, which is what we call Cuba and Haiti and all that country today. The second time, 2 years later, he came over, he brought some horses with him. These were the first horses in the Western Hemisphere in 10,000 years. There's a lot of emotion about horses. Horses are nice critters, and most of us like them. But I heard some discussion here before a congressional committee about protecting horses, and this one individual said, "Those animals roamed this country by the thousands 500 years ago." No, 500 years ago was 1505. There were a few horses in the West Indies. There were none on the mainland. There were some ranches there. 19, Cortez invaded Mexico, landed at Veracruz with 508 men and 17 or 18 horses and some primitive firearms. The horses and the firearms were something the Indians had never heard of. They were terrified of them to begin with. Well, Cortez was one of these guys, if you were looking for somebody to do a job for you, he's the kind of guy you'd hire. He read his job description, which was to get gold for the Spanish kingdom, and he took after doing his job. He left a lot of bodies, both Indian and white, behind him. Finally, as far north as and he did what he was told to do. Finally, as far north as what's now the American and Mexican border, they established quite a lot of silver mines. The mines had large ranches to support the mines. They provided meat, leather, horsepower. The Catholic Church established a number of large missions across that border. They had large ranches with many, many animals, thousands of cattle and horses. The Indians were largely slaves, and they took care of those animals. Down into Mexico, they were not permitted to ride. The Spanish gentlemen rode. As you got further north, the rules changed a little bit, and when you got up to about the border, the Indians were the vaqueros who worked the cattle, took care of the horses. They could ride. They knew about ropes and saddles. This, in about 1600, is where we are now. Well, you know, a slave's life is not that great. The salary is non-existent. There are no benefits. There are no days off. And every so often, a few of these guys would get tired of that. They'd take a few horses, some tack, and they'd go north. And this is how the horses started north to the United States. And they came in small groups. They'd find a tribe that would take them in, take care of them. They'd provide the tribe some horses and teach them how to use them. So the horses went north slowly in small groups. Started about 1600, but by 1725 they were well up into Canada. Lewis and Clark now have come up the Missouri, up the Jefferson. They're wading and dragging their canoes over the gravel bars, and they know this is as far as they're going to get unless they have horses. Sacagawea is their trump card. She's a Shoshone. They know that the Shoshones are close, and they are hoping that she will be able to assist them in getting horses. Well, as it turned out, that's what happened. We need to understand that those people, they had tons of equipment, supplies, trade goods. They suffered a lot of problems, tough weather. Some places there wasn't much game. They ate horses to stay alive. But if it hadn't been for the Indian tribes, they'd have turned around right there and gone back home, because they never would have gotten any further. They just loaded their canoes and headed down the river. But as it turned out, they did get horses from the Indians. Now, the Nez Perce kept their horses for them while they went on down the river to the coast, and then came back the following spring. Nez Perce had many horses, and in general, very good ones. And Captain Clark described them. Let me tell you what he said. Oops. He wrote upside down. Here's what he said about the Nez Perce horses. Their horses appear to be of an excellent race. They are lofty, elegantly formed, active, and durable. In short, many of them look like fine English coursers and would make a figure in any country. Some of these horses are pieded. Pieded is bad grammar. That's like saying somebody drowned it. Actually, what he's saying is pied. And he then describes what he means by pied. With large spots of white, irregularly scattered and intermixed with black, brown, bay, or some other dark color. And he considered those to be just excellent horses. Now, I called folks who run the Appaloosa registry, and they say that this is a Appaloosa. Mr. Clark didn't mention spots. I'm not going to argue with those folks. That's an interesting sidelight there. I have a friend that raises the American paint horse. She read this. Obviously, it's a paint horse. Well, it's one or the other. One thing to remember is that the Nez Perce knew a little more about managing horses than most of the rest of the tribes did, because they knew that you could castrate a horse, and that would be the end of any offspring from that animal. In fact, they neutered some horses for the expedition, and Sergeant Gass tells us that they did a better job of it than the white people did. And because those horses bled less, they were up quicker and ready to go to work quicker. Some of the horses that the expedition members neutered died. But Sergeant Gass didn't tell us what the difference was. What did they do different? Well, we don't know, because they didn't record that. But here's one of my guesses. If you have a large herd of horses, and how many you have doesn't make that much difference. If you have a lot of horses, and you want to upgrade the general quality of those horses, you castrate the ratty-looking stallions. And the Nez Perce had horses over 100 years before Lewis and Clark got there. You can eventually upgrade the whole population of horses. And it's my guess that that's what they were doing. And from that arrived at pretty good horses. What they considered a really first-class animal was a white stallion. And they gave Clark, as a gift, a white stallion. Next was a gray stallion. They gave Lewis a gray stallion. So, here these Indian folks have horses. What difference did it make to them in their life? Some of them, not a heck of a lot. If you look at the Pueblo Indians in the Southwest, in 1680, a number of those tribes got together for the common good, and they ran the Spanish out of that country. They killed the ones they could catch and scared the heck out of the rest of them, and they left. They got quite a few horses as a result of that. But they kept them at a Pueblo, they didn't. They weren't that really concerned about them. The Comanches, the Apaches took them home, and they knew what to do with them, and they became some of the finest light cavalry in this part of the world. So up till about in the 1820s and 30s is the first time horses came from the colonies. Fur trade people brought them, but to the Indians themselves, if they were agricultural people, the Mandans may have fit that. They used some horses to hunt, but they weren't really sold on them as the more the people who moved quite a lot. So here's a number of things. A lot of those folks moved every so often. They moved their teepees, they moved everything that they owned. When they moved, the load was carried by the women and the dogs. And when you're moving things that way, you try to keep it pretty light. When they got horses, they learned to make travois, and they could carry some heavier loads. So you could imagine that the teepees got bigger. They had more toys, and they had more goods, and it made a better way for them to move. They hunted buffalo. Before they got horses, there were a number of ways of killing buffalo. The common way that we know about is they ran them off a cliff, and that took some skill to do that, but they killed a lot of buffalo that way. But see, the nice part about that is they could move to the kill and process the meat, and they had, they were getting their winter supply ahead. When the horse came, then they killed buffalo horseback, and that made killing buffalo not only easier, but a lot more fun. And the Indian developed his buffalo horse and trained him, and he didn't use his hands to guide him. He used his knees. If he wanted to turn that way, he pushed with his right knee. If he wanted to turn that way, he pushed with his left knee. The horse knew that you got up alongside the right sides of the buffalo. The Indian had a short bow, put an arrow into the buffalo, sometimes clear through him, but then he just left that one. He shot into the lungs and left him, and went for some more. So when he got through, he had them scattered over quite a lot of country. And then finding that meat and processing it was not nearly as much fun for Mommy, because she had to find them, butcher them up out there in the prairie, and pack them home. So that was kind of a two-edged sword there. It was kind of good for some people, not so good for others. But another thing that occurred is that there's some pretty good evidence that once the Indians got horses, that they used fire to develop rangeland. They would burn brush. There's a pretty good feeling among the scientists that a lot of that savanna country in the northwest Washington, where there's rolling hills with good grass, there's scattered pine trees, but a lot of that was a result of continued burning by the Indians to produce pasture for their animals. And so it affected them different ways, and you look at their lifestyle, give you a pretty good idea of how it did, but most of them made pretty good use of them, and they were glad to get them. They didn't realize that with them there'd be a lot of things that weren't so good, and smallpox and whiskey are part of it. But that's part of history too. 1825 is the first time that the fur companies began bringing their trade goods out on pack strings, on horses. The first wagon was, I think, 1836. There were some wagons at the rendezvous, the fur trade rendezvous. Narcissa Whitman was there, and her husband, and they were missionaries. There was another couple who were missionaries. And from then on, horses were coming from the colonies, and you don't know what the mix of the horses were after that. Before that time, every horse was a result of those Spanish horses. And the saddles that we use today to work cattle are not much different, basically, on their basic components, than those saddles that the Spanish put together hundreds of years before that. So I'm going to quit there. And if you have some questions or comments, why, I'd be glad to discuss it with you.
One question I have is, this is a vast territory, distance-wise. If you were to leave here to the fort to go to Lewiston by horse, how many days are we talking about?
Well, on average, you aren't really pushing the animal 20 miles a day, horseback. Years ago, I was in the Border Patrol, down along the Mexican border. And one of the ways that the backcountry Mexican people had for measuring distance was how many days horseback? 20 miles. That's kind of the average. If you had a good, a good horse that could stand it, and you wanted to push him, well, you might go 30. But that's kind of what it was. It took quite a while. It took quite a while if you're going very far, but a lot better than walking. Anything else?
If you were going just without any kind of load, you could walk and ride, then you could go more miles, I suppose.
You probably could, yeah. I used to do some packing in the mountains in Wyoming, and I often did both.
Like the Pony Express, how far would they ride, like on one of their things?
Oh boy, I don't know. I try to make it a point never to say I don't know, but when it's the truth, that's what I do. I've read about the Pony Express, but I can't remember exactly what they could, they had their stations set up every so far, but they probably did not run all day. They probably maybe a half a day, and they changed ponies. So, you're probably looking at 40 miles in a day, because they're probably changing horses on the way. And they're light. The ad to hire them said they wanted light, young, wiry guys to ride to carry the mail.
Do you have any more questions? Or?
Well, I don't know. Like in Europe and wherever, Spain, there were a lot of horses there prior to being a lot of horses here. I mean, there were horses.
Oh yes.
So it was common in Europe.
Oh yes, and the thing is, they continually raised horses, not only for agriculture, but strongly for their war activity. And when Columbus brought the first horses, and some of the other folks came over, they had to have a special permission from the king and queen of Spain to bring mares, because they needed them to raise animals there. Have you seen the Lipizzaner stallion?
Yeah.
You ever seen that?
Mm-hmm.
Remember this one horse? Big animal with a man on his back, and that horse jumps straight in the air and kicks back.
Yeah.
You don't want to be where he's kicking. But that's what he was trained to do from a military standpoint. And the Spanish, they trained their horses and their cavalrymen to move fast. They'd get in, use a lance, and interesting thing is in our war with Mexico, the U.S. military sent Captain Walker back to the eastern part of the country to meet with Mr. Colt and design a pistol. And he designed the Walker pistol, which was the most powerful thing until the .357 Magnum came out in 1935. And these people were dragoons. They were horseback, and they each had two pistols on a saddle holster. They didn't carry them. A Walker pistol was 4 or 5 pounds. And they issued each guy two. Well, Mr. Walker, Captain Walker got done there, and Colt was making him, and he went back to the war, and Colt shipped the pistols, and Mr. Captain Walker was issued his too, and 2 days later he was killed by a Mexican with a lance. So all that firepower didn't help him. Yes.
From what you said, I would imagine that the Clydesdales, Percheron, big workhorses of the farming communities were not native to the United States, to the American lands. What year would those approximately, would those horses have been brought over by Europeans?
I don't know.
Okay.
See, you used the term native. The horses that were native to the Western Hemisphere all died out.
Right. Well, I meant versus the ones that the Mexicans that came up from Mexico that were Spanish.
The Spanish provided all the horses. You know, they had some beginnings in Africa. The Moors came up from Africa into Spain, took over part of it and stayed there 700 or 800 years. But they brought some good horses, and the beginnings of the Mammoth Jack, and well along on the Arabian. So those horses that finally came across had a lot of really good breeding and good training behind them. And when they came up into the country and people started using them, most of them made good use of them.
Any more questions? Thank you, Hoot.
You bet.